So, hello and welcome to the second webinar within the context of the road to the Connectathon. The Connectathon that will be held this year. And for today's session, we have Lucia Grundel, who is a systems engineer, and she's part of the technical team at Rexel LACPASS, and she was a monitor in the Sao Paulo Connectathon and will be monitoring the Connectathon this year too. So today we're going to continue. It's a continuation of the previous webinar, so let us go into some of the details that Fernando Portilla went into last week: FHIR, operations, and bundles. So without further ado, Lucia, the floor is all yours. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Allow me to share my screen, please. Can you see it well?
Bien. Los temas que vamos a estar viendo hoy en
So
la
the topics that we will be looking into in my presentation today, first of all, it's just going to be a review of some of the key concepts that Fernando covered last week. Then we're going to take a look at the implementation guide from the last year's Connectathon. The implementation guide describes the resources and the transactions for the project. Then we're going to take a look at the validation, instances, and resources. And then we will talk about one particular resource, which is bundles. Within the first part, I wanted to remind you that FHIR is an open standard and it's all published, so you can access it. Some of the key elements or some of the main components is this concept of resources, because within the standard, there's one part that describes all of the resources, and the resources are the information units that are exchanged. Each resource has a certain degree or ranking according to the level of maturity. Let's take a look at one resource, the resource patient. It always has a description, and then we have all of the resource structure. And within the structure, we have a whole set of attributes. And each attribute has a type of data, the different types of data. There are different types of data associated to the attributes that belong to a resource. Some of them are basic data, like, for example, a Boolean or dates. They are represented in smaller caps, and the other ones are structured. In this particular case, we have, for example, the identifier. This is the general representation of a resource with the structure, information, the attribute, the type of data, and the different type of data as a general element. This is an identifier, for example, that has a whole set of fields that make it up. Then the standard, a description of the standard, generally speaking, it's, well, a FHIR server in the center, and which is an important part of the architecture. On this FHIR Saver, we have the operations, the APIs, a REST. You can update a resource, you can read a resource, or you can see it. These are the operations that you can carry out. So that's the basic information for us to start looking at the topics that we want to look at today, which is the implementation guide. The implementation guide within part of a project describes the data, the models, the whole set of values, transactions, and the use of processing the standard in a particular case. Within the LACPASS project, the guide was published, it was developed and published in this URL, and this guide describes a set of resources which are used within the project and they will be exchanged in the different transactions. An implementation guide has three key elements. The first one is the definition of the profiles. The profiles take the resources defined within the standard and they set rules for their use within that context. So in this case, we have the patient resource. It has been identified and defined within the standard. And it can define the whole set of values that certain variables will have. It defines the mandatory fields, and it also defines extensions to different types of data or to different elements within the resource. In this case, in the project, we have a profile here, which is patient, which has the different valid identifiers that defined. Another important element in the implementation guide are the extensions. These are attributes or extensions to types of data that are included to the resources. So, for example, within the implementation guide of LACPASS, we then have certain attributes, these ones that are highlighted in green, which represent extensions to the immunization resource. This is added on information which are not defined within the base resource. The base resource is the one that is described originally in the guide. And something else that is added to an implementation guide are the value sets that they can take. So for example, they are, in this case, they are added with a code system and value set. Within the implementation guide, they were added, the marks to, for example, the different brands for the vaccinations with all of those values. We have another implementation guide, which is the IPS, which is the whole set of values that a variable can take. In this case, we have the code that can take these value sets. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is when the guide is published within the project, starting from raxel.org, we have on the tabs resources, and there we have tools, and there we have Gazelle. We have the location of the implementation guide and the GitHub project. So within the guide, let me comment on some general things. So the guide has a name, which you can see here. It represents Well, it describes what it is. We also have the version number here. And here at the bottom, it states when the guide was created and when it was published. Here on dependencies, it describes if there are other implementation guides that this one depends on. In this case, there's a strong dependence to the IPS guide. We will take a look at that when we see the resources. Here we have the home page. Then we have the artifacts that describes the different resources with the corresponding resource profiles. Here we have the transactions that have been modeled. These were the transactions that we worked with in the Connectathon last year. And in external, there's a set of links that are quite useful. So let me go through the different resource profiles. In this case, we have, for example, a patient resource organization. This one was for the transactions for the document records and a composition bundle and immunization. Probably for this year's project, we will add a few more resources, but it is important to understand how to read the guide and what the structure is all about, how to understand it, and the contributions that it makes, and the elements that are in it. So the first resource to be identified within the guide is the patient. This is the LAC patient, and each resource has a URL, or rather, each profile within the guide has a URL where the structure in the guide is represented. I will come back to this concept. Here we have the resource patient. I mean, there's always a description at the beginning. The resource, then patient, as I was saying, comes from the comes from patient IPS, which means that if we have the base resource, then IPS, and then we have lack patient, which adds new restrictions to the patient IPS. So in this case, it defines the identification that the patient resource will have. Here we can see the elements that are differential to this table or to this guide. Let's take a look at the ones that we can get from the IPS patient profile. Here we have two identifiers. One, which is the international identifier, which has a code that is fixed, PPN, passport, and a system that has to start with a certain structure, and then another identifier, which is the national identifier within the defined value sets. Now, these elements can be linked. So here we can go to the differential table. Let us not forget that here we're looking at the standard of FHIR patient structure. It has its attributes, and none of them are mandatory. They all have a zero there. The cardinality is zero. And what we added in the implementation guide or in the use that we're going to make of it within the LACPASS project is the different types of identifiers. There have to be at least two. And so what was added within the patient profile, LACA profile, to identify, we added then two identifiers. But as I was saying, It also inherits the properties that are defined in the IPS patient. In this case, it adds that the name, for example, is mandatory. And I think the other one is the date of birth. Please, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. If you think that I need to go deeper into something in particular at this point in time, please feel free to ask questions. If not, I will continue. This is another profile, composition. Composition represents the document. And here, this profile adds in the LACPASS guideline that the references are to resources defined within the same guide. For example, patient, it has to be the LAC patient, and the custodian organization has also got to make a reference to a LAC organization. This is the summary. It inherits the properties defined in the IPS guide, and it adds some additional identification elements that are associated to these ones. The LACA composition modifies the references to the resources that they are resources defined within the LAC guide. Okay, so that's the more general information regarding the implementation guide. And I know that you will be checking the IPS guideline in another workshop, but the IPS guideline is published. And the links take us to the current IPS guideline. So we can go here in bundle, IPS bundle. It has the structure. It all has the mandatory data. I mean, for each resource, it just adds new restrictions. But the objective is going from the closest, that is to say, LAC, then the IPS, and then the base resource to go to move in that direction. Very well. So the next thing is understanding then how from structures that have been defined within an implementation guide, how can we create the structures that my system is going to have to create, or within my transactions in order to exchange this with the server. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the concept of validation. What is to validate a resource or a transaction according to a profile? The objective here then is to define if a resource complies with the definition. I mean, if that resource then is consistent with the FHIR standard resource, but also if we're creating a resource associated to a profile, if that profile or that instance of a patient complies with the patient profile. So when carrying out a validation, we have to take a look at the information from the resource generation. But the first thing is to define the structure. It must check that all the content of the resource are described and that it has no additional information, that the resource has all of the contents that are described. Also cardinality, that they do correspond. So for example, if my profile has certain cardinalities as mandatory, a then it checks that. Then it checks the value domains, that each variable has the valid data sets. Then or value sets. Then that the displays a match.
El otro elemento a verificar en una validación es
The other element that needs to be checked in a validation
existe la posibilidad de agregar
is this
reglas
one, because there's a
asociadas a los
possibility
recursos.
to add
Por ejemplo,
rules associated to
en su regla
resources. For example, in the LAC
definir,
patient,
aparte de determinar las cardinalidades,
aside from
cuáles
determining the
son los
cardinality
indicadores obligatorios, se definió una
and
regla que
determining
hace que
these elements that are the mandatory identifiers, there's a
sean
rule
por lo
defined,
menos uno con uso oficial. O sea, tiene que haber
which means that there has to be at least one with an official
de
use.
tipo oficial y que aparte
One identifier must be official, is official type, and it has to start, or the system has to uh, start with UR or ID, that is to say, other rules really associated to the variables. These are the invariants. And then if the resource that we're validating
de acuerdo a un perfil específico, es agregarle también la lógica de
is in
validación.
line to a
Esos son
specific
como los 5
profile.
elementos o
These are like the five elements that have to be considered when carrying out the validation of a resource. First, associated to the structure, then to the profile.
Bien, acá es que vamos a ver cómo es que se termina
And
haciendo
we're
el marco de
going to
mecanismos de
see
validación. O sea,
the validation
hay
mechanisms.
los que
There
vamos a ver
are
hoy, en realidad
several
el objeto de
mechanisms. The
este
ones that we're going to look at within the
se
context of
enfoca
this
básicamente
project
en la
is
utilización de
like
recursos
Gazelle,
externos,
the use of external tools,
la,
Gazelle, as I
lo
was
que tiene
saying,
que ver
and
con
also
la validación de
the
una operación definida dentro de los
validation
sistemas de
operation
operación estándar, que es el
defined within standard
validation
operations,
validate. Acá describe en esta
which is
URL
the
los
FHIR
diferentes
operation.
mecanismos, o sea, bueno, qué es que se termina validando y los
And
diferentes
here
métodos
we
o
have
métodos
different
utilizados.
mechanisms that we
Eh,
have.
bueno, vamos a partir por lo que es la operación validate.
So let me start with
La
validate,
operación
the validate standard
se
operation.
aplica a un recurso, es una
This
operación estándar
dollar validate is
dentro
applied
del
to a
marco
resource. It's a standard operation
dentro de la especificación del estándar.
defined as part of the
Se
specifications
aplica a
of
un
the
recurso,
standard, and it
puede
is
ser
applied
recurso o a un recurso,
to a resource,
con un perfil para
or it
ejecutar
could
esta
be also
operación
to
sobre
apply to a
un
profile. When
recurso,
applying this operation on a
y
resource,
un otro recurso, la
it gives
operación
me back another
se dice
resource. That is to
acordada
say, an operation outcome
que
with the
seguirá la
different
operación.
severity degrees.
Voy mejor ilustrándolo el ejemplo un poquito más claro. Voy a trabajar con Postman para conceptualizar lo que es
Hold on just a second. I'm going to try and give you an example
validación de un recurso.
in order to
Esta
see the
operación
validation of a
es una
resource. This
operación que se aplica
operation
sobre un
is a validation. It's an
recurso.
operation that is
Casi
applied
todos
on the
los servidores de
resource.
FHIR soportan
Almost all FHIR servers
la operación.
support this
En este caso
operation.
voy a estar trabajando con
So in this case, I'm working
publicado
on
en el proyecto.
this
Es un
server
HAL.
that is published within the
Los,
project.
los servidores que están
These
publicados dentro
servers
de
that are published within the
pega la URL, okay. No sé si está publicada. Los servidores que están
so the
publicados dentro
servers,
de
as I was
Docker
saying, that
son
are published
HAL,
within the Docker are
tienen
happy, and
las operaciones de validación.
they have the validation
En este
operation
caso, este
enabled.
servidor
And in this
se encarga
particular
de definir,
case, this
ejecutar la
server,
operación para
aside
recursos base,
from allowing
tiene agregados los
these validation
perfiles
for base
definidos
resources, it
dentro del
also
recurso.
has the profiles defined within the
Por
project.
eso es que podemos validar,
And this
aparte
is
del
why
recurso,
we
lo
can
que decíamos
validate,
de la
aside
operación
from the
precedente,
resource
el
type,
estándar,
in this case that it
que
complies
sea
with the
un
patient
perfil
standard,
que
but
comparta
that
con
also that it is a
el
patient and that it
estándar.
complies with the LAC
Ahí lo que
profile.
iba a volver en
I said that I was going to go to the patient definition at some point. Here we have the URL that represents this profile. We can see it here so that it can actually comply. So when applying this operation on a resource, as I was saying, I get back another resource, which is an outcome, well, an operation outcome, whether it's valid, if it's got any error, and the severity of the error. And I believe that the best way to see this is with an example. This is the first example that I'm going to show you. As you can see, it has different levels of severity. And let us remember that interactions with a FHIR server are through resources. So that is to say, we send the patient resource, which is the one that I want to validate, and it gives me out another resource, which is the operation outcome, which is also a resource, which has its own specification. And it is used to define whether it's correct or if it has errors in the validation and the level of severity of the error and also the details. In this case, then the first thing that we're going to do is to validate. I've taken an example here. A patient with who is in the guideline. I'm sorry, and something that I got to mention is that within the guideline, we have the content, and here we have the examples. And I believe that we have examples for almost all the resources. This is the one that I'm going to be working on. So in this first case, it gives me the resource, the operation outcome, and also the severity. It says it's information. It didn't find any problems with it. In the next case, what I was going to do here is to modify the value set. So if I determine, for example, remember that this comes from the standard. Patient. The value sets associated to these variables are these ones. This is defined by the standard. And if I change this, instead of male, I make this masculino in Spanish, then I'm carrying out a validation as to the value sets of a variable. And in this case, it gives me the outcome is that it is unknown, that masculino is an unknown code. Gender does not correspond. And that's the information that we get for each of them. Other type of errors, for example, these ones already associated to the profile. You might recall that within the profile, within the LAC profile, it was defined that these two identifiers were needed, one that's international and that has the passport as a code, passport number as a code. And then the operation outcome, it gives me back that this is an error, and it says that the identifier that it has only one identifier. so that it's got one and that it should have at least two, and that it doesn't comply with the structure.
No corresponde con la estructura del, del paciente.
And that it doesn't comply with the patient structure.
El siguiente ejemplo que iba a mostrar,
The next example that I was going to show you is this one on structure. This is an example of a patient resource to which I added a tag that doesn't correspond. And in that particular case, I get back that the property is not recognized, it's not defined as an extension for that resource. Then the other case is a required field. So for this example, I had taken out the name. You may remember that the name was mandatory for the profile. It was not a restriction that added the patient LAC. It came from a patient IPS. So here the cardinality of name has got to be 1. And it says that a patient.name has a minimum of 1 required, but only found 0. And then the last examples of the invalidation report is that the invariants or the restrictions it had it to start with a UR or ID, and it says that it does not comply with that rule, that it starts with a URN or OOID. It has to start with URN or OID, and that's part of what's described in the profile. Okay, so these are the examples, the possible outcomes of the validate operation. Information, error in the case of a validation of the cardinality values that do not correspond, properties that have not been defined as part of the extension, and the second method, I mean, that's the part of the validate operation. And now I want to go to the second method, which is through Gazelle. And Gazelle is a platform that was used in the previous Connectathon. And within Gazelle, EVS client, in EVA's client standard variation service, here in IHE FHIR validate, here I can paste a resource or I can upload a file, and it has a whole set of validations available. In this particular case, it has for the validation of any standard resource. It also has for the IPS bundle document and for the LAC IPS, also for vaccinations and other sets of validations. So the idea is to add a content here. There was a problem with the Gazelle platform That's why I'm not sure whether it's going to actually work or not, but I do have some screenshots that I have taken. So what the Gazelle platform has is all the profiles created from the implementation guide and associated to the project. And that's why the LACs are here. LACPASS are the ones that have LACPASS as a tag at the beginning, which is a summary bundle, and the DDCC. It validates according to those implementation guide, and then the other one is the IPS, which is patient summary, and these are from the MHD profiles. These were the transactions that were tested in the previous Connectathon. When applying the validation on a JSON, it gives back that in this case that it worked well. So it says passed, which means that it's valid. And if not, it gives back the errors. Let me see if this works. I've got an example of one IPS that was used in the previous Connectathon. And when validating, it gives me back failed and the errors. This is a valid IPS, but it's not working. So this is as a second validation mechanism, Gazelle as a platform. So here I'm going to go into the last part of the three topics for today's session, the bundles. I was asked then to explain the bundle resource. It's a resource which is often used within the transactions and the FHIR project. And that's why they wanted me to explain the bundle resource. The first thing that we need to have clear is that bundle is a resource which is FHIR defined, which encompasses or which is understood as a container of several resources. The most common uses within this project are three types of bundles. This is the description of the bundle resource, the different types. And the first one is for transactions and the responses to those transactions. In order to carry out a transaction with a FHIR server and to define the methods that are applied to each resource that the bundle has. Then another use, which is quite common and broadly used, is to return a set of values that comply with a set of criteria as part of an operation in the server, and then the bundle document in order to represent a document as an instance of a bundle document with the corresponding elements. Then this bundle resource has entries, and then though for each entry, it could have additional elements according to the type of bundle defined. It could have information on the search, on the request, that is to say what we want to do with that entry, or it could have information on the response according to the criteria that are used. So let us look into it. This is the bundle resource. Bundle, it has a whole set of elements. And the only mandatory element for a bundle is the code, which defines the type of bundle it is. The type then is therefore the only mandatory one. In this case, a document, transaction response. These are the ones that are most broadly used. As I was saying, it has a whole set of entries, a collection of entries, and those entries, according to the type of bundle it is, some elements within those entries are mandatory. We have search, a request, a response, and we can see for each of the cases that that instance. So the first bundle type is transaction, and it allows us to carry out a set of the transactions against the FHIR server, and is the way of sending resources and to store them against the server. The FHIR server receives the request and processes it. In this case, in order to record a transaction of, let's say, 65, which is saving a document in a FHIR server, then a transaction bundle was used, is defined. It's defined within the MHT operations. 65 received a bundle transaction type and a whole set of entries. And for each of those entries, it defined what to do with each of these resources, whether it saved it or updated it. When the server receives the operation of a transaction bundle, it gives back, it returns what happens with each of those transactions. We're going to see that in an example. This is then the transaction bundle, and each of these entries correspond to the identification, resource identification, and the resource, and also the method applied for each resource. And this is the response that is obtained from the server when a transaction is carried out. In this case, for this transaction, which was a saving, it gives back what happens. In this case, it created and additional information for that resource. Just a couple of examples of transactions that are done with a transaction bundle. For example, it always goes to the base. I mean, if you do the post method and then the base. So in this case, bundle transaction, and this is the transaction 65 saving. For each of the entries, for each of the inputs, the resource is defined, and the method that will be applied when the server receives the transaction. It'll read the resources and what it does with each of those resources. So there, I've executed the transaction, and here we have a transaction response, and this is what it gives me back. What happens? The first one, for example, this one here, it was a list. It has saved it, and this is the location, and also additional information if applicable. Then another type of a transaction bundle is, for example, that are to carry out certain search transactions. For example, search on a server. The request that I'm sending is a GET, That is to say, it's a search type and it has a certain criteria. So in this case, we can run it. And this is what I get back. It gives me back the response for this search. So this is the transaction, and these transactions were carried out. So it gives me a response bundle, which is what we're going to be looking at in just a second. So this is the bundle type transaction. The next one is bundle type document, which is used for the conceptual representation of a document in FHIR as a set of information associated to a document that records information. It's the way in FHIR where you can have the bundle document, which has certain characteristics and resources that each bundle document must have. It must have the timestamp of when the document was created. And also within the entries, it has to have a composition which represents the document with the different sections with additional information each. The IPS is the International Patient Summary. The IPS is represented as a bundle document. Within the LAC guideline, we have the resource profile, LAC bundle, IPS bundle is here, and we add then the resources associated to this guideline. So this is an example of a bundle document. Those that participated in the previous Connectathon, they had to create an IPS, a bundle, a document, which must have a position in the different entries. The next type of bundle, bundle type, it's a is the response that we get when carrying out a search on a server. It is used then to see the resources that comply with the search criteria. So for example, if we do get, and here I'm searching for all the patients that comply with the beginning of a name SER, S-E-R. So each entry, each element of that set that complies with that criteria, and it has other attributes associated that are defined in the resource and that are used here. Total, for example, which the total number of resources that comply with the criteria. It's not mandatory to have this, and also a link for the response. So these attributes defined within the bundle resource are associated to the search type. And you can also, for that set, you can see the search type and the possibility of scores.
En este caso se hizo la búsqueda
So
y
in this case, the
se
search was
pudo
carried out
encontrar un servidor de prueba
against
que
a testing server
me devuelve
which
el
complies with
listado
a certain
de
criteria. It
recursos
gives me back
para cada uno de
a
esos
list of
servidores en la red
resources, and for each of
que
this,
hicimos.
the mode.
Em, Por ejemplo,
So this is the example.
creo que por ahí. No sé si hay duda o algo que...
Are
O
there
sea,
any
lo que vimos fue el primer
questions or
paso,
any
que
doubts? So what
como
we have seen,
hizo la guía de
the first pass
implementación,
is the
manejó el
implementation guide,
los
just an
elementos,
overview of
cómo
some of the
cargarlo,
elements and how they
usó la
vary,
guía, cómo la
the
guía
URLs of the
funciona,
guide, and
usó
how
las
we have
distintas propiedades
information that is inherited
de
from the other guidelines,
un
the
recurso
validation methods for a resource and the
y
possible
el
errors,
bundle, o sea,
and
y el
bundles,
bundle
the
y
types of
sí,
bundles
eso fueron
and
los
their
puntos
uses. These
principales
were the
que se
three
enfocaron
big topics that I
eh,
focused on in
eh,
this
no sé si hay
presentation.
dudas,
So, are
comentarios
there
o algo
any
que
questions, comments, or doubts?
estoy atenta.
Pueden levantar la mano si tienen alguna
You
consulta.
can raise your
Sí,
virtual hand.
solamente que fui rápido.
Or if I went too fast over something, I had 1 hour and I
Quedan
tried
4 minutos,
to.
no sé si
Yeah, we
quieran
still
hacer
have
preguntas.
3 minutes. I don't know if in 3 minutes
Tal
you're
vez
capable of.
saber dónde están
Maybe we
ubicados
need
los
to
sitios de
just
visita
specify. I mean,
disponibles
I saw that
con
you
los links
Sí,
pasted the one of the links on the chat
lo
pod.
que es importante es
The
entender
important thing is to
Raxel.org
understand within
dónde van
raxel.org
a ir siempre. O sea,
where they're going to be.
Raxel.org, esta es como el inicio de,
This is the home page.
dentro de Raxel.org
Within
hay recursos,
Raxel.org, we have resources. There we
herramientas,
have
y acá va a ir
tools.
todo lo que va a tener que
And
ver con
there we
Raxel.
have Gazelle,
Acá las
the,
distintas actualizaciones dentro de la
the
implementación, y
updated
acá
of the implementation guide,
donde
and
está
also the GitHub where we have the Docker
nos lleva después al
and
inicio.
everything else there.
Recursos, herramientas,
Resources, tools,
acá está la guía de
IPS,
implementación
LAC.
para
So these
artefactos,
the implementation guide. In Artifact, we have the different profiles,
igual la presentación después
and that's it.
subiremos.
Pregunta Francisco si se puede compartir una copia de la
So
grabación
can
para
you
poder
share the
en el
recording?
canal del
Yes,
web de
the
Raxel
recording
para
will be
poder
available in the
compartir.
Raxel web
Aquí
YouTube
dice,
channel.
Sí, a ver.
So
abajo al pie de página y ahí están los links a las distintas redes de
there
Raxel
at the
para
bottom,
el canal.
we have the links
Está disponible
to the
en
different
español y también
Raxel
en
channels. And the
traducción.
first one is the YouTube channel. It'll be available both in English
Así
and
es.
Spanish. And in fact, the previous session is already available.
Y bueno, la sección de iniciativas del mismo web de Raxel va a estar apareciendo
And
las semanas
the
siguientes.
initiatives
Así que
section in
cualquier consulta
Raxel
que
will be
tengan
coming up next week.
todo
The
lo que
possibility of
estuvimos
the
mostrando
2024
está
Connectathon,
asociado a la logística del evento y todos los aspectos más comunicacionales, como la
the
descarga, por ejemplo,
logistics,
segura.
I don't know,
Y ahí
the
verán
communication
también
related
incentivos para tener discusiones
aspects.
conversacionales
Once we have that
y también
defined,
manejo de
also
contenido y
the
presentación.
site and the links to everything that Lucia
Y
was
si no
sharing.
hay más
So
consultas en
if
este
there
instante,
are
vamos a
then
terminar
no
de
further questions
finalizar
now, remember
y
that you can still
bueno,
ask your
después de la
questions
transmisión
through any of the
los que
communication channels
participaron
that
en
we
el
have.
evento, correo electrónico
Slack
también para
for
quienes no,
the countries that participate in the Connectathon,
esperamos que
emails for
podamos
those that are not
ir cerrando la sesión
participating.
de hoy. Muchas
So
gracias
without any
por
further adu,
la
then we can
presentación
close
y
this
queda
session.
disponible para
Thank you,
cualquier
Lucia, for your
que
presentation. And again,
visitar o
it'll be
compartir
available for you
en
to
esta
double check
sesión.
it or to share it
Muchas
with
gracias
anyone
por
else
su
that you think
asistencia y
needs to see
nos
it. Thank
vemos
you
la
for
próxima
your
semana
attendance,
en
and we'll
sesión
see you next week in a new
Muchas
session.
gracias.
Bye bye. Thank
Subimos
you.
al canal al general cuando quede el problema de la casa. Gracias.
Hasta luego, buena tarde.
Muchas gracias, buenas tardes.